What does the election of Zohran Mamdani as mayor of New York City mean for those who live in the most Jewish city outside of the State of Israel? How has the normalization of anti-Zionist and openly anti-Semitic discourse and rhetoric made this possible? And what can those who care about Israel and the Jewish people do to reverse this trend? Just as important, what can be done to stop the drift of secular and liberal Jews, including those in the non-Orthodox denominations of Judaism, to halt the shift away from support for Israel and recognizing its centrality in Jewish life? Next, on Think Twice, we discuss this calamitous election and the future of American Jewry with one of the most important Reform rabbis in the world, Ammiel Hirsch of New York's Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. And welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation for you with Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch of the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York about the election of Zohran Mamdani and the future of American Jewry. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find The Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. The election of Zohran Mamdani as mayor of New York City is a watershed moment in the history of American Jewry. Not in living memory has someone whose entire career been animated by hostility to Israel and the Jews won high office in the United States. It's the culmination of a process by which toxic leftist ideas have essentially normalized, not merely hatred for the Jewish state, but also anti-Semitism. The impact of the progressive conquest of American education, media, and culture is the triumph of a candidate who believes that Israel has no right to exist and is comfortable with endangering American Jews by the globalization of the terrorist intifada. But what does this mean not merely for New York's Jews and those in the rest of the United States? Just as important, how will this impact the drift away from support for Israel among younger Jews, as well as those in the liberal religious denominations where a sense of Jewish peoplehood appears to be in decline? We're honored to have with us today one of the most thoughtful American Jewish voices to discuss all this. Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch is the senior rabbi of Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York City since 2004. And one of the leading figures not only of Reform Judaism, but of American Jewish discourse. His sermons are regularly broadcast on JBS TV, and he is the host of the bi-weekly podcast In These Times with Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch. A native of the Washington, D.C. area, he is a veteran of the Israel Defense Forces, a graduate of the London School of Economics and the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. He is also the author of The Lilac Tree, a rabbi's reflections on love, courage, and history, and the co-author of the acclaimed One People, Two Words, a Reform rabbi and an Orthodox rabbi explore the issues that divide them. Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch, welcome to Think Twice.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm a fan of yours. You're a beautiful writer and a great thinker.
Well, thanks very much, Rabbi. And thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us on a very consequential and busy day, the morning after the New York City mayoral election. I'll start by asking you for your reaction to the election of Zohran Mamdani. You were a very vocal critic of his during the campaign. What do you think is the feeling today among Jewish New Yorkers?
I think there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of concern, significant worry. Some hope, perhaps, that things will be good. He is a talented politician, and the elections were free and fair. And the majority of New Yorkers, and he did win a majority, over 50%. I think the majority of New Yorkers spoke. That's the rules of the game in democracy. There's always a hopefulness at the beginning of a new campaign, especially for somebody who's just burst onto the scene with no history. And there's a lot of enthusiasm by his supporters, which, of course, kind of is infectious, but also adds to the worry of the Jewish community, because he is a very, very talented politician. I had an opportunity to meet him in late August with several other rabbis, and I was worried about what he said, which I can go into detail with you. But
Please, yeah.
I was very impressed with his political skills.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell us about that meeting. What worried you specifically that he said in that in an interview, in a meeting where he was obviously interested in sort of winning over people like you who are politically liberal, who would normally be expected to be sympathetic to a Democratic candidate for mayor?
Well, one, as I said, he was very impressive as a politician, which worried me because I worry about his views. But we questioned him primarily about Jewish interests. There are all kinds of other interests that are connected to Jewish values and Jewish interests. Of course, we're citizens of New York, and Judaism has a lot to say about all of the major issues that were on the table for the elections or any elections. What we wanted to know specifically was with respect to the well-being of the Jewish community. That included the individual well-being of individual Jews, Jewish institutions, and Jewish organizational life. And of course, our relationship with the state of Israel that is rooted in the Zionist idea, which he is opposed to. Mm-hmm. And the Zionist idea, in turn, is rooted in fundamental Jewish values that go back to antiquity, really. So we've never had, there are really three areas that are quite astonishing that you have to consider when evaluating his convincing victory. One, he never really had a job, certainly not a management job. And he aspired to and now will be the senior manager of maybe the most complicated political bureaucracy in the United States. He's a socialist in the most capitalistic city in the history of civilization. And he's an anti-Zionist in the city that has the most Jews in the world. More Jews live in New York than any city in Israel. So his ascendancy is really quite astonishing. It's very worrying for the Jewish community because history demonstrates to us that wherever anti-Zionism is normalized and wherever it has support, anti-Zionism has support from high-level government officials, as night follows day, hostility to Jews increases. So I don't know. He has said over and over again that his anti-Zionism constitutes a core principle of his political ideology. That basically came through in the meeting that we had with him as well, which is why by the end of the meeting, all of us were taken aback and worried. And we'll see. I mean, he wants his mayoralty to be successful. I hope that he is pragmatic and considers the issues on which he ran, local issues, transportation issues, crime, cost of living, affordability. I hope that he focuses on that and less on his anti-Zionism. But he's a committed anti-Zionist ideologue. And that's why it's so difficult for him to explain away his support for Globalize the Intifada and Free Palestine and From the River to the Sea, because that's the core of that anti-Zionist ideology. I asked him when we met, what would bring a teenager? This was 15 or 16 years ago when he graduated school and became a student at Bowdoin College in Maine, which is an elite liberal arts school. He co-founded the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter, which this was 15 or 16 years ago. It was 13, 14 years before October 7th. Mm-hmm. What would lead a teenager who grew up in New York City and many Jewish friends, including I've spoken with some of our congregants, one congregant in particular who was in school with him. And his responses were, in effect, non-responses and unconvincing. And that caused me and my colleagues to have increased anxiety that, one, he could actually win because he has the political skills to win and he has the support. And two, this anti-Zionist ideology is uncompromising. I don't think he seeks harm to Jews in New York. I don't think it's that. He told us that he has no intention of reducing security around and police presence around Jewish institutions. And I take that at face value because it's not in his political interest. First of all, I don't think he's the kind of person that enjoys Jews being harmed or attacked. I don't think that at all. And secondly, it's not in his political interests that, heaven forbid, a Jewish institution, a Jewish school is attacked and there are many casualties, and people will trace that back to some kind of reduction in police security. That would be really very detrimental to his mayoralty and to the brand that he wants to promote in America and in the Democratic Party. So I took that at face value. But the problem is that if I'm right, and this is an historical fact, really, that normalized anti-Zionism from government officials leads to increased anti-Semitism, you could put 50 police outside of Jewish institutions, but within an atmosphere, an environment of increasing hostility to Israel, it becomes more dangerous for Jews and for the Jewish community.
Yeah,
that's what I worry about most.
Yeah, I think that's a very apt observation because, and after all, we're not starting from zero when it comes to anti-Semitism. We're in the middle of a surge of anti-Semitism that's gone on for, 2 years since October 7th. So, that's a very justified worry. Let's take a step back to sort of, and I do want to get to, what New York, how this will directly impact New Yorkers. But I think it's fair to say that not too long ago, someone with Mamdani's attitudes towards Israel and Jewish life, Zionism, and I think it's equally true, would never have stood a chance of winning high office, even in deep blue New York, or receive the support of most Democrats. So the question is, what, in your opinion, is the main reason why discourse such as this, which he has embraced, which is at the core of his being as a politician, as a person, has not only been normalized, but essentially legitimized?
Well, first of all, I worry deeply about that as well. That's the second component. Because as you say, the attitudes that he represents, the views that he represents, on the socialist issue and also the competence issue, but in particular on the Zionism issues that are really at the core of our being here. What he has done, and all of the every political establishment is looking and taking note. For sure, the Democratic Party, but as you've written very eloquently recently, there's a growing problem in the Republican Party as well. Everybody, including the far right in the Republican Party, is looking carefully at what happened here in New York City. And they will conclude or may conclude and certainly observe precisely what you said, that not only is anti-Zionism hostility to Israel, and even leaving aside anti-Zionism, legitimate criticism of Israel that is so harsh that politicians essentially didn't believe and sought to avoid. They see that this approach not only didn't prevent him from winning, it was actually a winning argument. Some of the exit polls showed that the last I saw was that 38% of New York voters considered his views on Israel to be a significant factor in their vote. Now it cuts both ways.
Yeah, when I saw that too, and it's like, well, that's a lot of votes for Cuomo there too.
That's right. But the point I'm making is he had a very rigid ideological position on Zionism, and not only did it not harm him you might be able to make the case that it actually helped him.
It was certainly energized his base, for sure.
Yeah. That's very worrying because the struggle inside the Democratic Party is to further increase the influence of these far left, problematic to Israel, and therefore problematic to Jews views. But you know more about this than I do. But I think it'll also have an impact on the Republican Party as well, and on the problematic side to Israel of the Republican Party also.
Well, we'll see how that works out on the Republican side. Certainly, I know back in June, Tucker Carlson seemed, very happy about Mamdani because it was sort of like, well, that got the Jews upset, so that was, that was a bright spot for him. And I don't want to, in evaluating this, I think it's important not to catastrophize the situation. As bad as this isn't Germany in 1933, despite some of the really apocalyptic rhetoric, which I understand that is coming out of some people in the community. But we're now still facing a situation where anti-Semitism is ubiquitous in our public discourse on the left. And as you noted, and I've written a lot about it in recent years, and especially in the last week, also on the right. How do American Jews, most of whom have little personal experience dealing with active Jew hatred, navigate this new and altogether different world as they go about their lives, whether you're talking about in New York or somewhere else?
It's shocking, isn't it, that things have changed so quickly. Now, when things like this change so quickly, usually, maybe always, stuff was happening underground for many years that people didn't really pay too much attention to, and all it takes is something to happen to lift the lid on this Pandora's jar. And it's really fascinating that it took October 7th to do that, that by sunset of October 7th, there were already protests against Israel. Even before Israel had a chance to respond, and there was blood running in the streets and in the fields of Israel. So it is sobering to think that much of this stuff was underground, but the lid was on it, and something about October 7th lifted the lid. And what we saw, and I can tell you I'm a liberal rabbi, as you mentioned, in the heart of the Upper West Side, and a historically important Reform congregation that was established by Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was very active. He was one of the co-founders of the NAACP and the ACLU. He was a ferocious fighter to protect workers' rights and unions. So these were classically then, and still are to a certain degree, liberal positions within the mainstream of the liberal intellectual and political world. And that's where the majority of Jews, and I'm not voicing a partisan position here, I'm simply as an observer stating that since the end of World War II, that's where most Jews have ended up, both in the intellectual, communal realm, academic realm, as well as the political realm. Overwhelmingly, it's been reflected in electoral politics by something like 2/3 and sometimes more Jewish support, electorally as well as financially, of Democratic candidates. And that's where we found our home. We felt that was most consistent in the liberal establishment, most consistent with what our understanding of Jewish values was, as well as what we felt was in the best interests of the American Jewish community. In other words, a tolerant, liberal, pluralistic environment was good for everybody, and it was good for Jews as well. And when you move away from that, then Jewish life becomes more difficult. That was essentially the approach of the American Jewish community since the days of FDR, since the end of World War II. And so there basically no American Jew alive who has experienced the kind of anti-Semitism that erupted post-October 7th. And it was a shock. for us. I'm a congregational rabbi, and I had, for months, I had people waltzing through the office in tears, expressing shock and dismay, both physically, because they would walk down the streets and encounter vicious protests against Israel that had anti-Semitic elements to it. But also their kids were in universities, and they were going through what we all know was happening in the universities. And it was completely shocking. One, the American Jewish community has no experience in this kind of anti-Semitism. Since I mean, things were more difficult pre-World War II, but almost none of us were alive at that time.
Mm.
And it became difficult on a day-to-day basis, and it became difficult ideologically because these groups, these forces, these partners who were our allies in the struggle for civil rights, women's rights, minority rights, where we locked arms and marched arm in arm together. At best, many of them disappointed us, and some of them actually betrayed us. So I think it's caused enormous dissonance in the American Jewish community, most of which is, or was at least, liberal, and still we're still traumatized by it. And we're only at the very beginning of a much longer process that still has to shake out with a lot of unknowns. I'm actually curious. You're a really perceptive observer of it. What do you think? How do you explain the vote in New York?
Well, I think it's partly, I was up late writing a column to do that. As my daughter would say, just sit there and quote yourself. I think two main factors, obviously, the legitimization of views such as those of that are at the heart of Zohran Mamdani's, career and life. If the New York Times is publishing, articles all the time saying, these things, essentially delegitimizing the state of Israel, not merely just, harsh criticisms or even, sort of mimicking Hamas propaganda about genocide or apartheid, but really advocating for Israel's destruction. Why would you expect voters in a very deep blue liberal city not to, think, well, that's normal. There's nothing wrong with that. I think also, speaking as a native New Yorker, someone who was born in Manhattan, although I don't live there right now, I think New York has changed demographically, and that has changed the Democratic Party in New York. The New York that elected Rudy Giuliani twice in the 1990s and then Michael Bloomberg for 3 times after that doesn't really exist anymore. I think a lot of the white ethnic vote just doesn't is not there anymore in the outer boroughs, and which might have worked against the election of Zohran Mamdani. And I think just the overall shift to the left within the Democratic Party, sort of the constituencies that are that created him are much stronger. I think it's these are basic facts. You can argue good, bad, whatever. That made him, that made this, possible and maybe even inevitable. So that's my answer on one foot. Obviously, there were other factors. Obviously, two very dismal alternatives. Andrew Cuomo was a heavy lift for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. Someone who was chased out of the governor's governorship because of sexual harassment and bullying charges, and was kind of an authoritarian during COVID and made some disastrous decisions. Curtis Sliwa, nice guy, but he's a gadfly, and the candidate of a very minor party in a deep blue city. So expecting either of them to defeat Mamdani, and expecting them to work together to defeat him was probably impossible given the egos and the political interests involved. And ironically, maybe even Eric maybe had right after the June primary, had they worked together, all the non-Mamdani candidates worked together to create a fusion ticket, as it would have been called in an earlier era in New York's history, maybe that would have worked, but that didn't happen. And then, ironically, Mayor Eric Adams' withdrawal actually, I think, helped Mamdani because the lack of a African-American or minority candidate actually increased his vote from the June primary to November in the minority communities. So there you go. I mean, it was a perfect storm for him. And as you say, he's a very talented politician, a fresh face running against people who have been, on the front page of the New York Post for the last, 3 or 4 decades. At any rate, let's turn now to a discussion of the changes within American Jewry that you've been very vocal about in recent years. You've noted the shift away from overwhelming support for Israel among liberal Jews and in the Reform movement as well. What do you think is the primary cause of that? Because after all, there were Jews who voted for Mamdani, and these were not Tucker Carlson supporters. These were, liberal Democrats, left-wing Democrats. What is the primary cause of the shift within a part of the Jewish community, and what can we do about it?
So this, too, is very complicated, and there are many, many factors. I'll give you a couple of them that I've been focused on and preoccupied with for several years now. The Reform movement in the United States started on the basis of a theology, a religious ideology of anti-peoplehood. It was a philosophy that was grounded in full acceptance of the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, and the Emancipation. And in very colorful language, the founders of liberal Judaism in America expressed loyalty not only to those basic ideas, which overlapped significantly in terms of what they understood to be prophetic values, but also they felt they had an almost messianic acceptance of this universalistic philosophy that heralded the ushering in of a new era for humanity, a more peaceful, more tolerant era that would guarantee the solution, what they used to call the solution to the Jewish problem. It was good for the Jews, and that this kind of universalism that was embodied by the Enlightenment it surpassed the narrower, from their perspective, the narrower ethnic, nationalistic, peoplehood-based philosophy of Judaism that was at the core of the Jewish understanding for millennia. And so that was really the essence of the Reform Revolution. It took me a couple of decades to really figure this out. And I think I'm right. This is my theory. I'm increasingly convinced that I'm right. I was in the heart of the Reform establishment when I was the director of ARTZA, which is the Reform Zionist arm, in the headquarters of the Union for Reform Judaism. And so I was able to see this firsthand as well. And so that was the philosophy of the founders of liberal Judaism. It was an acceptance of universalism, not as an extension of Jewish peoplehood, which is the essence of Judaism. The essence of Judaism and the genius of Judaism is a blend between what we call universalism and particularism. It is universalistic in terms of its prophetic reach to the nations at large, but it's grounded and rooted in Jewish peoplehood and Jewish particularism. And the really revolutionary part of Reform Judaism in North America, which really is not only restricted to the narrower movement instrumentality, it basically embraces liberal Jews, is a full acceptance of universalistic principles at the beginning, not as an extension or an expression of Jewish peoplehood, but to the negation of Jewish peoplehood. That was the essence of the Reform Revolution. And it was immediately controversial. It was well accepted, broadly accepted. It is what defined, in many respects, a liberal Jew in the diaspora. And it was considered the solution to the Jewish problem. What is the solution to anti-Semitism? It being grounded and rooted in unreason. The age of reason. The age of reason was the answer to the unreasonableness of anti-Semitism, the age of science and evidence and rationality and so on and so forth. But it took maybe 2 decades for that theory to begin to unravel, and you didn't need to be a theologian to understand that that was wrong. All you had to do was open a newspaper and see that in the heart of the most enlightened European countries, there was rampant anti-Semitism. And, of course, that was the answer of Theodor Herzl and the Zionists. They also said, yes, anti-Semitism is unreasonable. But as opposed to the liberal Jews in the diaspora, who felt that the Enlightenment was the solution to anti-Semitism, Herzl and the Zionists came forth and said, anti-Semitism is unreasonable. It's so unreasonable that it can't be solved in any way, even through the age of reason. And therefore, the only solution was to get out of the way, because sooner or later, this European emancipation, with all of its technological and scientific power, could eventually consume the Jewish people. It could be used against the Jewish people. Now, I don't think anybody could have anticipated the dimensions of the Holocaust, but the Zionists did intuit that that there was something in the heart of the philosophy of European Enlightenment that could be easily turned against the Jews, and they feared that very much. And so they said, the solution to the Jewish problem is to get out of the way of Europe and to form a collective self-determination entity. And that increasingly became obvious to observers in the Jewish world, including in the liberal Jewish world. So by the time of World War II, and certainly in the aftermath and by the time Israel was created, the Reform movement itself essentially discarded this anti-peoplehood theory.
Yeah,
philosophy.
the two leaders, main leaders of American Zionism in the 1940s were 2 Reform rabbis, including one whose synagogue you now serve.
Exactly. You mean Rabbi Stephen Wise and Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch.
Exactly.
There's something
great leaders who really disliked each other, if you know the history. Stephen Wise is often remembered more for, the arguments about the Holocaust, but he was an ardent Zionist.
He became a Zionist in 1898. He attended the Second Zionist Congress in Basel and fell in love with Herzl and became a lifelong Zionist. It said it changed his life. So, by the way, I do think it's significant in some ways that the 2 great leaders of American Zionism in the 20th century were Reform rabbis. They were so consumed in opposition to this anti-peoplehood perspective of Zionism that it almost put them on fire. And they became committed Zionists and committed to changing the approach of the American Reform movement, which, as I said, by mid-20th century had essentially discarded this anti-peoplehood position and therefore could embrace Zionism, because Zionism, at its core, albeit from a secular perspective initially, almost all of them were secular Jews. Herzl himself was a secular Jew. But they understood that the Jews are a people. That is the essence of the Jewish condition. So, of course, the Reform movement that had adopted an anti-peoplehood position were going to be anti-Zionist. All of that dissipated by mid-20th century. And by the time I got to Arza in 1990, Two, all of us assumed, and our generation of rabbis, we all assumed that the Reform movement had relegated this philosophy to the ash heap of history. It survived for 2 or 3 decades, and it was gone. What I now think, and I became increasingly concerned with attitudes within the Reform movement, what I now think is what was the exception was not the anti-Peoplehood philosophy of Reform Judaism or liberal Judaism in the diaspora. The exception was the 20th century that imposed existential threat after existential threat on the Jewish people, beginning with the pogroms in Europe, in Eastern Europe at the beginning of the century, through, of course, the Holocaust, to a lesser degree, but still significant, to the plight of Soviet Jewry, and Israel, and the creation of Israel, this very vulnerable country and had its origins. But what happened towards the end of the 20th century is American Jews no longer felt existentially threatened at all. We were embraced completely, almost, by American society. So embraced that they wanted to marry us, too. They thought we were good partners for marriage. They didn't feel that Israel was existentially threatened. To the contrary, in particular, younger generations, they looked at Israel and they saw cycles of war and violence, and many of them concluded that Israel was exercising disproportional force, that it was kind of the neighborhood bully. So if you remove the element of the existential, the perception of the existential threat on the Jews, which was pervasive throughout most of the 20th century, what you're left with is the original default position of liberal Judaism in the diaspora, which is a preference for universalism, for sure, and for many, and we're seeing this very clearly now among what we might call the hard left in the Jewish community, not only a preference for universal values, but a full embrace of universal values at the expense of Jewish peoplehood. It's that element of Jewish peoplehood that is so problematic, that is the obstacle to the ushering in of a better universalistic era in the history of civilization. So I think that's what's happening, and I don't think we saw that clearly enough. I myself didn't really see that until about 10 or 15 years ago. And consequently, to the extent that we had influence over our congregants and over generations of young people, we miscalculated our approach to teaching Jewish universalism. And, it's kind of partially a slogan now, Tikkun Olam. It's rooted in Jewish tradition, that phrase, Tikkun Olam. And to the extent that it means Jews care about the well-being of everybody, that is absolutely grounded in Judaism from the very beginning. We're reading the beginning passages of Genesis. The first Jew, Abraham, receives the call to found a new nation, and God tells him, all the nations of the earth, you shall be a blessing, and all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves through you. So right there we have, you shall found a nation, you shall be a great nation. But the purpose of this nation is to be a blessing to all the nations of the world, all the families of the world. So as what I said before, this blend is really fundamental in Judaism. If you remove one at the expense of the other, you impoverish Judaism. Both need to be in balance. But what I think happened to us is we overemphasized, we mistaught prophetic values. There was no prophet in the entire book of prophecies in Judaism, of course in the Bible, that there was no prophet who considered himself a universalist, as we would understand it today, and discarding their sense of commitment to Judaism. To the contrary, they were all rooted in the Jewish experience. They all wanted the well-being of the Jewish people. And we neglected that part of our teaching, I think, in some capacity. And so what we have is a contemporary phenomenon in the Reform movement of alumni of ours, students of ours. You might recall that rabbinical students signed a really problematic letter in 2021, and then within 6 weeks, I believe, of October 7th, 2023, there were well over 1,000 alumni of Reform synagogues who signed a very problematic letter with respect to the war itself. And what they were saying is, you are betraying the values that you taught us because we are committed to Tikkun Olam. We learned that from you, and you're violating the very central values that you conveyed to us, with the implication that we are hypocritical and not consistent with our values when it comes to our own narrow self-interest. And I think that indicated, at least it indicated to me, and it caused me to rethink all of the educational programs and all of the messages that I'm conveying and all of the organizational effort that I've mounted within the Reform movement to restore the balance. It caused in me a realization that we mistaught Tikkun Olam. Not that we emphasized universal values in the sense that Jews need to care about the well-being of others. But somehow or another, we conveyed to many of those youngsters over 2 generations that that Tikkun Olam meant helping poor people in rural communities in America or some other place in the world, and neglecting the poor people of the poor Jews of Ukraine or of various other, or of Israel for that matter. So that's the big reclamation and restoration project ahead of us in the Reform movement. And I would say one thing: I realize that many, if not most, of your listeners don't necessarily identify as liberal Jews or Reform Jews or members of Reform synagogues. But what we're doing here, and the effort that we've mounted in the Reform movement to stop this, to slow down this process, stop it and reverse it, is critical to the future well-being of the American Jewish community, because the Reform movement is simply too big to fail. So what we're trying to do is in everybody's interest, whether they consider themselves liberal Jews or not.
No, I think that's absolutely right. The failure of a major segment of the Jewish community affects everyone, whether they agree with it or whether they go to that synagogue or not. So I guess the question is, how do we promote Jewish peoplehood and even Jewish nationalism to a population of young Jews that is not only predisposed to think of any sectarian loyalty as somehow wrong or racist, because that is not merely what they've been getting from liberal institutions like the Reform movement, but also from liberal education in the United States. It's the whole point about the debate about sort of the woke takeover of elite colleges and colleges in general. How do we roll that back? How do we teach young people to think that it's okay to support the rights of the Jewish people to live in their ancestral homeland the way they would support other people's rights?
Well, the short answer, which I'll elaborate on momentarily, is we have to recognize the problem and convey the values that we want to be able to convey to all of our people, including, of course, young people. But you mentioned something really very interesting, and it is important to emphasize that why is it that so many young liberal, and not necessarily liberal in the narrow sense that we would define it, why so many young Jews were so easily swayed to be supportive not only of those who were critical of Israel. I'm all for that. I'm all for criticism, debate, argumentation, and so on. But these were enemies of the Jewish people and enemies of Israel who wanted to destroy Israel. How could it be that our alumni, our graduates, young Jews, are joining those people and, having Passover Seders and encampments and all kinds of really bizarre phenomena? Part of it is there's simply a very deep and broad Jewish illiteracy in the American Jewish community. Most American Jews don't go to day schools. They don't go to summer camps. Even the ones who are affiliated with a synagogue, and that's less than 50% of the American Jewish community. At least 50%, probably more, are not affiliated with any Jewish organization whatsoever. On this day, the majority of American Jews are not affiliated with any Jewish organization. So even the ones that are affiliated, remember, for most of them, they are acquiring Judaism, whatever they get through their families, and through supplemental religious education, which is very challenging. I mean, if you have 1 or 2 or 3 hours a week with kids who are tired by the time they get to you, and they're there for 4 or 5 or 6 years, and then they consider the Bar Mitzvah Day, Liberation Day, it injects a level of Jewish illiteracy that is unprecedented in Jewish history. And I think part of it is that part of it is it's exceedingly difficult, even if you have the right approach, to instill it when so many don't get it from home and don't get it and don't simply have enough time to get it from Jewish institutions. So I think the challenge of Jewish literacy is a huge challenge for the American Jewish community. And to the extent that there are philanthropists that are listening to us now, one of the lessons of October 7th needs to be the Jewish community, Jewish institutions, especially those institutions that inject Jewish identity and Jewish knowledge, and outside the Orthodox community, those are 3 primary institutions: day schools, summer camps, and synagogues. They need your support now more than ever. And they certainly need it more than alma maters who might have disappointed us or even betrayed us. So that's number one. And then what we teach when we have them is also important. And we, for example, we're reevaluating everything. And we are going to continue to teach Tikkun Olam, but we're going to teach Tikkun Olam properly, as the prophets understood it. I love to, every time I fly to Israel, I look from the window of the plane and I see the shoreline of Tel Aviv, I recite these verses at the conclusion of the book of Amos, where he says, "I will restore my people." This is Amos, the person who said, Martin Luther King used to quote Amos all the time, "Let justice roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." But they don't emphasize the other part of what Amos said. And he concludes the book by saying, "I shall restore my people Israel. They shall rebuild ruined cities and inhabit them. They shall plant their vineyards and eat their fruit. And I will plant them on their own soil, never more to be uprooted from the soil I have given them." Is there a more particularistic sentiment than that? And that's the universalistic prophet Amos. So we need to be able to teach that. And it starts with self-love, self-respect, and understanding of what we represent and how we can be a blessing to the world entire.
Well, that's a very important point. I know we're up against a time deadline. We're going to have to let you go. I hope we can have you back. Lots more to discuss. I had many more questions for you. Thanks again for coming on, Rabbi Hirsch.
It's my pleasure, and I'm a fan of yours. Keep up the terrific work.
Well, thank you very much. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to read JNS at jns.org, subscribe to our newsletters, and also tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which is available on all the audio podcast platforms. And whether you're listening to us there, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.